points before you guys leave, things to think about. We're all exposed to these chemicals in the water you drink, in the food you eat, in the microwaving, in plastics, that sort of thing. So you're getting these chemicals. Industry's not testing for safety of these chemicals necessarily. Okay? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So you can't be certain that the effects are being tested for. And the government's tests, as you heard today, are inadequate to ensure that the chemicals you're being exposed to are safe. So you have no way of knowing that these chemicals, as they're in your body, they're in a young mother or a fetus's body, are safe. And in fact, they're not. First question I'd like to start off with, and then I'll turn it over to everybody else for questions, is you mentioned a number of these chemicals, Tom, bisphenol A, PDBs, triclosan, and PCBs. Where are these chemicals found? How are people going to be exposed to these chemicals?
Good question. I think we don't know the answer fully. Bisphenol A has been studied a lot for a long time.
It's in plastics, right?
It's in plastics, but it's also in food. It's in lines, cans, at least some cans, and so it can get into people in the food. But it also turns out to be on cash register receipts. In fact, high levels are on cash register receipts. It's probably also, for example, one study showed that pizza boxes, you've got a pizza, it's kind of greasy, you put it on the box. This is recycled. The cardboard is recycled. It's got a lot of bisphenol A. It leaches out. So high levels of bisphenol A and things like this, it's so pervasive, I don't think that we can say for certain where it comes from. But levels in humans are, first of all, it doesn't last a long time in the human system. So the fact that 93% of the human population have bisphenol A at any one time means that we're getting it all the time. PCBs, it's in the food, it's in milk, it's in dairy, it's in dust particles. It's extremely pervasive. Triclosan, I know less about. There's been less study about it. It's used as an antibacterial agent, so it's in this kind of antibacterial hand cream. It's also in some toothpaste that is incredibly effective as an anti-gingivitis. Yeah,
Colgate toothpaste.
Yeah. I would not give it to your kid, but it works really well if you have some kinds of gum problems. Which actually is kind of a thought that, these are drugs. They're all acting like drugs. I don't know of any physician who would prescribe a drug to everybody, to every man, woman, child, and fetus in the country. Yet, drugs are important. We can think of it like that. They also interact in ways that we don't fully understand. PBDEs are a flame retardant. They're extremely high in airplane cabins. They're also on foam, furniture, in new carpeting, all this kind of stuff. They spray it on, so it comes off. And it's at high levels in children, especially California because of their flame retardant rules. They're actually very high concentrations in children.
Questions from the audience? You guys got to have some questions about this stuff. No questions? Nothing?
For that question, you mentioned that USGS is completing a comprehensive study looking at multiple sources. What's settled for when that study is completed, and is there preliminary indications as to what?
You mean the drinking water currents study? Yeah, we're working with EPA right now, looking at a number of drinking water treatment facilities across the country. We're looking at pre-treatment, post-treatment. It's in the middle. It's a several-year study, and we expect something out from next year.
Go ahead.
Just sort of following up on that, I think a lot of people assume that once source water has been treated by drinking water facilities, that it takes out all of these chemicals. Could you touch a little bit on pharmaceuticals and endocrine disrupting chemicals and whether or not they're treated for and removed in the drinking water treatment process?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. The treatment processes aren't really designed to take some of these trace organic chemicals out. They're very challenging to remove. Different treatment processes are a little better for some than others. Some of the compounds seem to persist through all the treatment processes. The kind of work that we do looking at that now is when we do look at a series of wastewater treatment plants and look at inflows and outflow concentrations of the chemicals, we tend to track which type of treatment processes are being used, see which ones might be a little more effective at reducing the concentrations, and also understanding how the concentrations are reduced. Like I mentioned earlier, in some cases where the chemical might be adsorbed to solids that's then removed and introduced to the environment in a different way, like through land application. But we've got to be careful that that's not just introducing to the environment through a different mechanism and that it is effective. So that's, I think it's more than just treatment processes too. There's a lot of just best management practices, how to manage animal feeding operation, different aspects of it, lagoon handling, manure handling and storage, and which processes we're actually doing now, a national study of different types of animal feeding operations across the country, helping to understand which chemicals might be being released associated with different types of animal feeding operations. I think also there are some things that people can do on a voluntary basis, like for pharmaceuticals, taking compounds and not just flushing them so that they become fast-tracked through a water system and they go to a wastewater treatment plant and then are deposited in our stream, so that there's recommendations now to take them and mix them with trash and solid waste so that they go in a landfill, with the hopes that that might provide a mechanism to degrade the compounds and let them degrade in a different way. We're actually sampling landfill leachate now to see if they in fact degrade in the landfill leachates, or whether they come out because many landfill leachates are deposited through wastewater treatment plants again. And so we want to just make sure that they are effective mechanisms for degrading those kind of compounds too. Did that get out of your question?
Keep in mind too, you mentioned the Potomac River study, which was one of the early studies on intersex fish, and we're drinking that water, by the way, those fish are living in. We get all of our water from the Potomac River right here at the Capitol Building. Other questions?
I was wondering if you could talk, I think there's a number of members in Congress who are interested in the issue of autism, and given the large effects of population, that everyone knows someone. What mounting evidence and belief that it is endocrine disrupting chemicals as a factor, or how close can you say?
I think the debate at this moment is really to what extent environmental factors play a role in this. Now, I think that anytime you have a disorder that's defined by behavioral and not biochemical kinds of criteria, it's going to be difficult. There was a study in South Korea that was published just a little while ago. In South Korea, autistic spectrum disorders are really underreported. And what they did was to go into the school system and do de novo diagnosis and try to come up with some prevalence. That study showed that the prevalence was much higher than any previous study had shown. It doesn't prove that there's an increase in the prevalence, but it was the first time that a single method for defining the criteria were used. Today here, we're really using old methods from 1960s or 70s, 80s, etc., using methods today and trying to compare those, and that makes it difficult. There was a study that came out of California that linked the exposures to 3 different pesticides to autism. And that actually, I think, should really be carefully considered, because when you begin to see these kind of regional differences in the incidence and prevalence of autism and its association with these kind of environmental chemicals, then I think that we're going to get somewhere. But in terms of, when I think of the way in which thyroid hormone acts during development and how could that produce some of the features of autism, mechanistically we don't understand autism. So, there's a lot of speculation, because thyroid hormone regulates processes that are known to be probably kind of derailed during the onset of autism. Does that prove that it's thyroid hormone, or that factors are interfering with thyroid hormone signaling? I can't defend that.
Go ahead.
I had a follow-up question. You just mentioned pesticides very briefly, and I know some of the pesticides, like atrazine that you talked about today, are in fact endocrine disruptors. And I remember reading a USGS study that looked at pesticides in streams and surface water, and had found some, like 80% of streams had levels of pesticides that were detectable. And I was wondering if you knew anything about whether or not those levels of detection are of health concern as well.
Yeah, I think it depends on what standard you use for health control, for health effects. There are maximum contaminant levels that are defined as drinking water standards, and so a few of the compounds exceeded those levels. But because we're just trying to understand what levels and which chemicals are endocrine active, we're not at that point with respect to all of those chemicals. And then when you start to consider the fact that there might be additive effects of looking at multiple pesticides, and when we say we pick a chemical like a pesticide or something like that, I tend, when we talk about endocrine disruption, to say pull back for a second, because we have to think about it in terms of many different chemicals together. And when I put the estrogenicity graph up there, again, I'm just looking at one type of hormone and one type of thing, and we added them up, and as Tom pointed out, that's a very simple tool to use to demonstrate that we've got to be thinking of different chemicals. There's, as he pointed out, we don't fully understand all the different ways that these estrogenic or other hormonally active chemicals can actually have effects on different receptors and that kind of thing in the body. So you can't go much farther than that.
If I could just follow up a little bit on that. When we think about these mixtures, oftentimes we're hearing this idea of additive effects. You add up all the estrogenic compounds, and estrogenicity is defined in a very specific way when they say that. Atrazine works probably, or at least the speculation is, the evidence is, that it acts through aromatase, which is an enzyme that produces estrogen from testosterone. The estrogenicity assay, when you define an estrogen, doesn't have anything to do with aromatase. The ways in which chemicals add into interfering with an endocrine system by acting on many different levels of the organization of the system hasn't even begun to, that technology hasn't even begun to be developed. We're really behind the curve here. So when we talk about trying to get a handle on mixtures, it's a very big problem, mainly because, you know, human biology as well as animal biology is complicated. Why would we think it would be simple? But the way we're talking about it sort of implies that it is simple. We can just add it up, and many of these kind of additive studies do show that if you add up all the estrogenic compounds, defining estrogenicity in the same way for all these compounds, it has an additive effect. I'm quite certain that that is an underestimation when you think of the kinds of compounds that can interfere with estrogen metabolism or estrogen production, etc.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, just to make sure I understand. I think I heard you say that the tests that we're doing now don't necessarily, aren't calibrated to pick up the effects of these chemicals. And that even the ones that are, very, very, very low dose exposure can be having the effects that you guys have been talking about. True, right?
Yeah.